In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, something happened that medicine recorded carefully, without myths, without legends, and without the comfort of a clear explanation. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with a single woman named Frau Trophäa. She stepped out into the street, not to perform, not to celebrate, not to draw attention, but simply because her body began to move. She started dancing, without music, without rhythm, without joy. There was no smile, no laughter, no sense of pleasure in her movements. This was not expression, it was compulsion. Hours passed and she did not stop. Her feet kept moving against the stone streets as sweat soaked her clothes. Her breathing became erratic. Her muscles tightened and released in painful spasms. Witnesses noticed her face twisting, not with delight, but with strain and fear. Her eyes looked unfocused, almost trapped, as if she were watching herself from somewhere far away. By nightfall, she was still moving. By the next day, she had not slept. She had barely eaten, yet her body continued, obeying something no one else could see. Doctors were called, and they did what physicians of the time always did first. They observed. They saw no fever that explained it, no wound, no poison they could identify. This was not drunkenness, not madness in the way madness was understood then. Her pulse was racing, her skin was hot, her muscles trembled under constant strain. Every sign pointed to a body being pushed far beyond its limits, yet refusing to shut down. This is the crucial detail history preserves. Frau Trophäa was not enjoying herself, she was suffering in public. The dance was not art, not culture, not celebration, it was a visible loss of control. A neurological event unfolding in real time, written directly onto the muscles, the sweat, the pain etched into her face. What terrified those watching was not the movement itself, but the absence of choice behind it. She did not decide to dance. Her body had made that decision without asking her mind. By the time people realized this was not a spectacle, but a medical anomaly, it was already too late to dismiss it as an isolated incident. Because what began with one woman would soon pull an entire city into the same uncontrollable rhythm, and medicine would be forced to confront a terrifying possibility, that under the right conditions, the human body can revolt against the will, openly, violently, and in front of everyone.
What shocked the physicians even more was that the movement did not fade. It did not slow after exhaustion, and it did not stop after pain should have taken over. Frau Trophäa continued to dance for days, and then for weeks, her body locked into motion as if a switch had been flipped and broken. She did not sleep in any meaningful way. At most, she collapsed for short moments, only for her legs to resume their frantic rhythm as soon as she rose. Food became irregular, almost irrelevant, because the body's demand to move overpowered hunger, rest, and reason alike. This is where the event crossed a crucial medical line. Voluntary actions weaken with fatigue, muscles fail, coordination collapses, conscious intent gives way to rest, but her movement followed a different rulebook entirely. It persisted beyond what a healthy nervous system should allow. Her muscles burned, cramped, and trembled, yet they continued to fire. Her joints swelled, her feet bled. Still, the motion went on. Doctors examined her as best they could with the knowledge of the 16th century. They searched for visible illness, for injuries, for signs of poisoning or possession, because those were the available frameworks. But they found no clear physical cause that could explain such sustained, purposeless activity. There was no infection that fit, no fever that explained the intensity, no wound that triggered it. The body was failing, but the signal driving it would not shut off. This is the critical distinction history often misses. This was not dancing in the human sense of the word. There was no timing, no music, no pattern meant to please or communicate. The movements were repetitive, erratic, and inefficient, the kind of motion produced when higher control centers of the brain lose authority and more primitive motor circuits take over. What observers were witnessing was not expression, but a collapse of inhibition. In modern terms, this resembles an acute loss of voluntary motor control, where the brain's ability to regulate movement is overridden by runaway neural signaling. The mind remains present enough to experience fear and pain, but powerless to intervene. The body becomes a machine running without a break, consuming itself with every step. That is why this event terrified physicians even more than the crowd. If this were a disease of choice, it could be stopped. If it were madness, it could be confined. But this was something else entirely, a nervous system hijacking its own host. Not a dance driven by desire, but a body trapped in motion, proving that under extreme conditions, control is not guaranteed.
What transformed a disturbing medical curiosity into a full-scale crisis was not the endurance of a single body, but the moment the condition began to spread. Within days, one observer joined her, then another, then several more. At first, the connection seemed coincidental, almost dismissible, but the pattern refused to stay small. By the end of the first weeks, dozens of people were moving in the same uncontrollable way, collapsing, rising, and continuing as if pulled by an invisible current. Within a month, the number had climbed toward 400, all displaying the same exhausted faces, the same rigid movements, the same terrifying inability to stop. What made this outbreak medically unsettling was what it lacked. There was no known virus to blame, no fever that passed from body to body, no contaminated water or shared food source that could explain the distribution. People did not need to touch one another. They did not need to share a home, a bed, or a meal. Some had simply stood in the street and watched. Others had heard stories and arrived later. In several cases, the onset occurred after nothing more than witnessing the scene, as if the act of observation itself had become the trigger. This defied every traditional model of contagion. Physical diseases require proximity, exchange, or exposure. Here, the only consistent link was perception, seeing the movement, absorbing the fear, watching a body lose control in public. The nervous system of the observer did the rest. Muscles that should have remained quiet began to twitch, balance faltered, voluntary control weakened, and once the first involuntary steps appeared, panic completed the loop, amplifying the response until the body joined the dance against its will. What spread through Strasbourg was not a microbe, but a state of mind embedded in a body, a shared psychological environment saturated with stress, fear, and expectation turned individual nervous systems into mirrors of one another. Each new dancer reinforced the reality of the phenomenon, making it harder for others to resist. The more people watched, the more believable the loss of control became, and the more likely their own control would fracture. This is why the outbreak moved so fast and ignored physical boundaries. The infection traveled through attention and belief, through empathy and terror, through a population already primed by hardship. No handshake was needed, no wound was required. The brain, confronted with enough examples of collapse, learned the pattern and repeated it. In that moment, Strasbourg became a living demonstration of a dangerous truth. Under extreme collective stress, the human nervous system can synchronize in destructive ways. The body does not need germs to break. Sometimes, all it needs is to watch. As the days dragged on and the number of dancers grew, the spectacle turned from disturbing to lethal.
This was not symbolic movement or ritual motion that the body could sustain. It was relentless, forced activity driven by a nervous system stuck in overdrive. Muscles contracted for hours without rest, joints absorbed repeated impact, and the body's internal reserves were burned faster than they could be replaced. Water was lost through constant sweating, yet many victims were too disoriented or exhausted to drink. Dehydration set in quietly at first, then violently, thickening the blood and straining the heart with every beat. Body temperature rose as the dancers moved under the summer sun or in crowded spaces, their heat regulation systems overwhelmed. What began as exertion turned into hyperthermia, cooking tissues from the inside and disrupting the delicate chemistry that keeps cells alive. Muscles, deprived of oxygen and energy, began to break down, releasing toxic byproducts into the bloodstream. This muscular failure was not just pain or fatigue, it was a cascade that could shut down kidneys and poison the body from within. Falls were frequent and brutal. Legs buckled without warning, and bodies struck stone streets again and again. Bones fractured, ligaments tore. Yet even injury did not always stop the movement. Some victims rose and continued, driven by a nervous command they could not silence. Others collapsed and never stood again. The heart, pushed beyond its limits by dehydration, overheating, and stress hormones, began to fail. Irregular rhythms spiraled into cardiac arrest. In others, blood vessels ruptured or clotted, triggering strokes that ended the dance instantly. At the height of the outbreak, historical accounts suggest that as many as 15 people were dying each day. These were not fragile individuals succumbing to illness in bed, but otherwise functional adults whose bodies were destroyed by motion alone. The deaths were sudden, shocking, and difficult to comprehend for those who witnessed them, because there was no visible wound and no clear disease to blame. The true cause was brutally simple. The human body is designed for movement, but only within limits. Muscles require rest, the heart requires balance, and the nervous system requires the ability to disengage. Forced, continuous motion overrides every protective mechanism evolution built into us. Once the command to stop is lost, the body becomes its own executioner. The dancers did not die from madness, poison, or punishment. They died because the human body was never meant to move without mercy. What made this event so deeply unsettling to physicians then and so disturbing to scientists now is not the dancing itself, but the pattern behind it. Human illness almost always follows individuality. One body fails before another. Symptoms vary. Severity differs. Causes can usually be traced to something tangible: a pathogen, a toxin, an injury, a defect. But in Strasbourg, none of those rules applied. This was not one person collapsing under a private illness. It was hundreds of people, unrelated by blood or health, responding in the same way at the same time with the same loss of control. Their bodies behaved as if they were linked by an invisible circuit. There was no identifiable lesion in the brain, no fever pattern that suggested infection, no poison found in common food or water that could fully explain the behavior. And yet the symptoms were real, measurable, and deadly. Muscles contracted, hearts failed, people died. Medicine was forced to confront a terrifying possibility: that the nervous system does not always need physical damage to malfunction, and that behavior itself can become contagious without a microbe carrying it. What unfolded looked less like disease and more like synchronization. One nervous system entered collapse and others followed, not through touch or breath, but through observation and shared meaning. The sight of uncontrolled movement, framed by fear, belief, and expectation, seemed to bypass conscious choice and trigger the same response in others. It was as if the brain, under enough collective stress, could abandon individuality and fall into a shared malfunction. This is why the dancing plague does not fit neatly into the category of epidemics. There was no incubation period to measure, no immune response to track, no cure to administer. Instead, there was a feedback loop between mind and body, amplified by social context. Stress fed fear, fear fed expectation, expectation shaped symptoms, symptoms reinforced belief, and the loop tightened until bodies broke. Medically, this was not an infection of tissue, but an infection of behavior, driven by neural circuits that evolved to mirror, empathize, and respond to others. Those same circuits, under extreme pressure, became the mechanism of collapse. The event forced medicine, centuries before neuroscience existed, to face a truth it still grapples with today: that the brain can generate real, lethal physical symptoms without any visible organic cause, and that under the right conditions, it can do so not alone, but together. The first major explanation put forward by historians and medical researchers was ergot poisoning, a theory rooted in chemistry and neurology rather than myth or superstition. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on grains such as rye and wheat, especially in damp conditions, and medieval Europe consumed these grains daily with little ability to detect contamination. This fungus produces alkaloid compounds that are chemically related to substances later synthesized into LSD, meaning they can profoundly affect the human nervous system. When ingested, ergot can trigger vivid hallucinations, intense muscle spasms, convulsions, distorted perception of reality, and a frightening loss of bodily control. On the surface, this seems like a perfect match for the bizarre behaviors seen during the dancing plague: people moving uncontrollably, appearing disconnected from pain, reality, or exhaustion, and behaving in ways that made no rational sense to observers at the time. The theory suggests that entire communities could have unknowingly consumed contaminated bread, leading to a shared neurological reaction that spread rapidly through the population. However, when examined more closely, this explanation begins to crack. Ergot poisoning does not merely stimulate movement or induce altered states of consciousness. It is notorious for causing severe vasoconstriction, meaning it narrows blood vessels and restricts blood flow to the extremities. This often results in extreme pain, numbness, burning sensations, paralysis, and in severe cases, gangrene so devastating that victims historically lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs. The body under ergot poisoning typically becomes rigid, weak, and damaged, not capable of sustained rhythmic motion. Victims are more likely to collapse than to dance, more likely to scream in agony than to move continuously for hours or days. Most critically, ergot poisoning does not selectively produce coordinated, prolonged dancing behavior across large groups without quickly incapacitating them. The physical damage it causes would make days of continuous movement virtually impossible. For this reason, while ergot may explain confusion, hallucinations, or isolated neurological symptoms, it fails to account for the most defining feature of the event: people dancing relentlessly, collectively, and repetitively, sometimes until they collapsed or died, without showing the classic physical breakdown that ergot inevitably produces. This fundamental contradiction is where the ergot theory ultimately falls apart, leaving researchers to search for explanations beyond simple chemical poisoning. The second, and to many modern researchers far more convincing explanation, is mass psychogenic illness, often called collective hysteria, a phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as very real physical symptoms that spread through a community without any infectious agent involved. To understand why this could happen in Strasbourg in 1518, you have to step into the mental and emotional landscape of the city itself. This was a population living under relentless pressure,
Years of famine had weakened bodies and minds. Floods had destroyed crops and homes. Epidemics like plague were never far from memory, and poverty was widespread and crushing. On top of this constant physical hardship was an overwhelming religious atmosphere that framed suffering as divine punishment. Fear of sin, damnation, and supernatural retribution was not abstract. It was woven into daily life, sermons, and personal identity. People lived in a state of chronic anxiety, expecting disaster, and interpreting pain as a moral failure. This was not a stable psychological environment. It was a community stretched to the breaking point. Under such sustained stress, the human brain can enter a state of dissociation, where normal voluntary control over the body begins to weaken. Dissociation is not imaginary or symbolic. It is a measurable neurological response in which the brain disconnects conscious intention from motor behavior as a coping mechanism. In extreme cases, movement can occur automatically without deliberate choice, driven by deeply buried emotional circuits rather than conscious thought. When Frau Troffea began dancing in the street, her behavior did not register in others as a random act. To unconscious minds already primed by fear, exhaustion, and belief in spiritual possession or curses, her movements acted like a trigger. The brain, especially under stress, is highly imitative. Mirror neurons activate when we observe others' actions, and in vulnerable psychological states, this imitation can bypass rational filters. People did not decide to join her. Their nervous systems recognized the behavior as an outlet, a release, and copied it. This is where the idea of contagion becomes crucial. Nothing was transmitted through air, water, or food. What spread was a pattern of behavior embedded in the collective psyche. Seeing someone lose control gave others permission, at a subconscious level, to lose control as well. The dancing was not performance or celebration. It was the body discharging unbearable psychological tension through movement. Once it began, the social feedback loop intensified the effect. Crowds gathered, fear increased, attention amplified the behavior, and each new dancer reinforced the reality of the phenomenon for everyone else. In such conditions, the line between individual breakdown and group behavior dissolves. The city did not witness separate cases of madness. It experienced a synchronized nervous collapse, where the human mind, overwhelmed by sustained trauma, expressed itself through the only language it had left: the body. To understand why the symptom took the specific form of dancing and not screaming, paralysis, or violence, you have to look beyond biology and into the symbolic language of the time. In medieval European culture, the body was not seen as a neutral machine. It was a moral instrument, a vessel constantly judged by God and society. Movement itself carried meaning. Uncontrolled motion was not interpreted as a medical issue, but as a spiritual signal. Compulsive dancing had long been associated with sin, divine punishment, and possession. Stories of people cursed to dance until collapse already existed in folklore, sermons, and collective memory. Saints like Saint Vitus were invoked to cure or punish those afflicted with involuntary movement, and the idea that God could force a sinner's body to move against their will was widely accepted. This cultural backdrop mattered deeply because the human mind does not express distress randomly. Under extreme psychological pressure, it reaches for symbols that already exist, symbols that make sense within the shared worldview. In a society where suffering was moralized and explained through religion, the unconscious did not invent a new form of expression. It selected one that was already loaded with meaning. Dancing was visible, public, unmistakable. It was a bodily confession written in motion. The afflicted were not choosing to dance. Their nervous systems were translating terror, guilt, hunger, and exhaustion into the only behavior that aligned with the cultural script of punishment and loss of spiritual control. To stop moving would have felt, on a deep psychological level, like resisting the very force believed to be causing the suffering. The more they danced, the more real the affliction became, both to themselves and to those watching. Culture acted like a mold, shaping raw neurological breakdown into a recognizable form. If the same psychological stress had occurred in a different era, the symptoms would likely have looked different. In another century, it might have manifested as fainting, seizures, or mass paralysis. But in 1518 Strasbourg, the symbolic vocabulary available to the mind pointed toward movement, compulsion, and visible penance. The brain did not consciously decide, "I will dance." Instead, it followed a deeply ingrained narrative about how divine punishment appears in the body. In that sense, the dancing plague was not just a medical mystery, but a cultural echo, a moment where belief, fear, and physiology aligned so perfectly that an entire city moved to the same invisible rhythm, driven not by music, but by meaning. The phenomenon surrounding St. Vitus's curse illustrates the power of expectation over the body in a way that modern medicine now recognizes as the nocebo effect, though nobody in 1518 had the language to describe it. In a community steeped in religious fear, belief was not abstract, it was embodied. People did not simply think they might be punished, their nervous systems were literally interpreting that fear as a signal to act, to move, to manifest the punishment physically. The mind, interpreting signals of stress, famine, and anxiety through the lens of deeply held cultural narratives, translated the dread of divine wrath into involuntary motion. Watching one person fall into this state was enough to trigger the same responses in observers, because the collective unconscious absorbed the signal, processed it as real threat, and responded with identical physical symptoms. The expectation of suffering became a self-fulfilling prophecy, each new dancer reinforcing the belief in the curse for the next, creating a feedback loop of fear and compulsion. What we now understand as psychosomatic illness, where the body expresses psychological stress as physical symptoms, was on full display, magnified by culture, shared belief, and social contagion. In this way, the St. Vitus narrative was not merely superstition, it was a framework through which a city's population could externalize its anxieties, transforming them into a terrifying, unstoppable physical force that the rational mind could not simply override. The nocebo effect, long before its discovery, had claimed hundreds of victims, showing that sometimes the body obeys the mind in ways far more literal and devastating than anyone could anticipate, turning belief itself into a form of mass pathology. The response of the authorities in Strasbourg represents one of the most tragic miscalculations in medical history, a vivid reminder that even well-intentioned intervention can amplify disaster when guided by misunderstanding. Believing that the afflicted needed to dance out the illness, city leaders erected stages in the public squares, hired musicians to play tirelessly, and actively encouraged the sufferers to keep moving, framing the involuntary convulsions as a form of therapeutic release. But the effect was catastrophic. Instead of alleviating the condition, this intervention fed directly into it. Each drumbeat, each footstep, each public display of exhaustion served as reinforcement, signaling to both the participants and the onlookers that the dance was necessary, urgent, and, most alarmingly, socially endorsed. The neurological and psychological contagion intensified. Spectators became participants, participants became more desperate, and the lines between voluntary and involuntary motion blurred entirely.
Reports from the period describe exhausted dancers collapsing from dehydration, muscle failure, and sheer cardiovascular strain, while those attempting to intervene could do nothing but watch as the dance consumed body after body. Deaths, which might have been avoided with simple isolation and rest, multiplied, and the medical rationale of the day, grounded in superstition, incomplete knowledge, and the assumption that movement would purge the disease, became a deadly accelerant. What was intended as care turned into amplification, and the city squares, once places of social gathering, became stages of collective suffering. The authorities' actions demonstrate a chilling lesson. When fear and misunderstanding drive intervention, the very measures designed to heal can instead become the engine of catastrophe, transforming a medical mystery into a human tragedy writ large across the cobblestones of Strasbourg.
The end of the dancing plague did not arrive through any cure, scientific breakthrough, or medical insight. It came slowly, almost as if the city itself exhaled in relief. Authorities finally recognized that the relentless movement, the music, and the public spectacle were worsening the crisis rather than alleviating it. Gradually, they began to isolate the afflicted, removing them from the crowded streets and relocating them to monasteries, chapels, and other religious sites where observation and containment could occur. The drummers fell silent, the stages were dismantled, and the relentless public encouragement ceased. With the absence of these social triggers, the collective compulsion began to fade, and the psychological contagion lost its grip. Individuals who had danced for days or even weeks began to collapse from sheer exhaustion, sleep, and eventually a fragile return to bodily control. Yet, it was not that the victims were cured in any medical sense. Their nervous systems had not been healed by medicine, nor had the underlying stress and fear vanished. What changed was the environment. The social pressure, the performative expectation, and the mass observation that had sustained the outbreak were removed. The city regained a fragile calm, the streets returned to their normal rhythms, and the hysteria dissipated. The dancing plague did not end with triumph or treatment. It ended because the conditions that fueled it, the panic, the crowd, and the cultural reinforcement, were dismantled, leaving behind a city scarred by collective fear, but slowly reclaiming its humanity.
Today, a phenomenon like the dancing plague of 1518 seems almost unimaginable. Yet it has not disappeared entirely. It has merely transformed. Modern psychiatry provides frameworks to understand extreme psychosomatic reactions, mass hysteria, and psychogenic illnesses, turning what once appeared as unexplainable madness into conditions that can be studied, diagnosed, and treated. Scientific explanations, neurochemical imbalances, stress responses, social contagion allow doctors to recognize patterns before they escalate into crises. Societies no longer share the same collective belief that sin or divine wrath must be physically expelled through uncontrolled movement, and this cultural lens that once legitimized extreme actions has largely vanished. Diagnostic tools, early intervention, isolation of cases, and methods to calm affected individuals act as buffers, preventing localized outbreaks from spiraling into public catastrophes. Hospitals, mental health institutions, and emergency protocols provide structured responses to psychological crises that previously would have run unchecked through entire communities. Yet the human brain remains capable of extraordinary influence over the body, and while the outward spectacle of mass dancing is gone, the underlying mechanism, a mind in extreme stress overwhelming the body, a contagion of fear and anxiety spreading through observation and expectation, still exists, manifesting now as faint echoes in fainting epidemics, mass psychosomatic reactions, and sudden emotional collapses, proving that the mind's power over the body is timeless, even if its expression has evolved.
Even in the modern world, the echoes of the 1518 dancing plague persist in subtle but striking ways. Across schools, workplaces, and tightly knit communities, sudden waves of fainting or dizziness sometimes sweep through groups with no identifiable medical cause. Entire classrooms may find multiple students collapsing or experiencing temporary paralysis, their bodies betraying no organic illness, yet responding to stress, suggestion, or collective anxiety. Panic can cascade like a virus, moving from one individual to another, as the human brain unconsciously mirrors the tension and fear of those around it. Mass panic at concerts or sporting events, psychosomatic reactions in hospitals, or sudden outbreaks of hyperventilation during exams are contemporary expressions of the same basic phenomenon, a group's shared psychological state manifesting physically, sometimes with alarming intensity. The mind, as history shows, retains the power to override physical control, to compel bodies into actions that defy logic, to convert cultural, emotional, or social pressure into tangible, often dangerous movement. Even without the overt spectacle of non-stop dancing, the underlying principle remains. Human physiology is inseparable from human psychology, and collective fear, belief, or suggestion can still turn a community into a stage where the body responds in ways the mind barely comprehends, proving that the ills of 1518 were not just curiosities of a bygone era. They are timeless warnings of how fragile the barrier is between mental stress and physical collapse. In reflecting on the philosophical angle, one must ask, who truly was the patient? Was it Frau Trophäa alone, the woman who first stepped into the streets and lost control of her own body? Or was it the city of Strasbourg itself, a society under crushing pressure from famine, disease, religious fear, and social instability? The disease transcended individual physiology. It became a collective manifestation, a language of despair spoken not in words but in movement. The bodies of hundreds of citizens communicated a stress so deep, so uncontainable, that it erupted physically, as if the only way to express helplessness was through unrelenting, agonizing dance. The human body, when pushed to the limits of psychological endurance, can betray its own mind, becoming both the messenger and the victim. This event forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that illness is not always chemical or microbial, that culture and environment shape biology, and that the brain can impose symptoms with the same intensity as any virus or toxin. The medical reality of the dancing plague is just as stark. It was not merely individual madness, nor was it simply a toxic reaction to contaminated food or fungi. It was a collective neurological and psychological breakdown amplified by shared fear, societal expectations, and the catastrophic failure of contemporary medical understanding. The physicians of the time, unable to comprehend the forces at play, sometimes worsened the crisis, reinforcing the behaviors they sought to cure. The plague's victims suffered exhaustion, dehydration, cardiac events, and in some cases death, their suffering a direct consequence of the body's response to unrelenting psychological pressure. The ultimate lesson is both humbling and terrifying. When the mind's capacity to process stress, fear, and despair collapses, the body may seize control in ways that are visible, devastating, and sometimes fatal. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that human beings are not just biological machines reacting to pathogens. We are profoundly social and psychological entities, capable of suffering and communicating pain collectively.
In the end, when reason fails and the mind is overwhelmed, the body becomes the voice, and sometimes that voice speaks in movement so extreme it can dance, even to death.